Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to our listeners of this broadcast. My name is Catherine Benish. I'm the Chief of Operations Strategy, Policy, and Oversight at the MBTA. This is a recorded broadcast of the presentation we plan to give on August 12th and August 13th for public meetings on the fall 2020 bus service changes. I am also joined by two other representatives from the MBTA who will now ask to introduce themselves. The first is Melissa DeLay. Melissa?
Hello, my name is Melissa Dulé. I'm the Senior Director of Service Planning.
Thank you, Melissa. And we are also joined by Anthony Thomas. Anthony?
Hi, this is Anthony Thomas, Manager of Policy Development and Outreach for the MBTA.
Wonderful. Thank you both. We will now go through the presentation, and as this is a recorded presentation, the intent of this is to get feedback from our community, customers, riders, municipalities, and others, and would direct you to provide any feedback on mbta.com/service changes to provide any detailed feedback on the overall changes or the specific route changes that may be affecting you or your community. The intent of this presentation is to walk through not only what is changing on August 30th, 2020, but also the why and the how of these decisions that were made. First and foremost, we are changing bus service this fall for three main reasons and three main things that drove our decisions. The first is we are trying to accommodate changing ridership patterns as part of COVID-19. The second is to support physical distancing for both our riders and our employees. And the third, we are trying to optimize bus service with the finite resources that we have, both bus operators and actual buses. We will now go into depth on each of these three items. The first is that since early March, we have seen at the MBTA very significant changing ridership patterns. These patterns are not dissimilar from those seen by other transit agencies around the United States. Probably the key takeaways are that ridership has remained most steady on our bus routes compared to other modes. The following slide will show a chart highlighting this, but fundamentally that bus ridership dropped less during the early weeks of the pandemic versus our other modes and is also recovering more quickly. Bus ridership as of mid-July was about 40% of our baseline ridership we typically see, versus some of our rail lines, it was significantly lower, and commuter rail lower beyond that. However, ridership on bus routes has actually varied from route to route. And we find that there's been a number of drivers that explains those differences. The first is that we've seen ridership highest on the routes that serve those essential trips, whether that is to a medical center, to a grocery store, to a caretaking community, in communities that are predominantly minority or low income, areas with geographic barriers like Boston Harbor, which make walking and biking difficult. So there's limited ability to switch between modes, and fundamentally communities with fewer residents who can work from home. In comparison, we find that ridership has been lowest on those routes that serve the opposites of those, right? Those that are primarily 9 to 5 work commuters, communities with more residents who have access to jobs that allow them to telework, and communities with more access to vehicles or other modes of transit. This is highlighted to the first point on changing ridership patterns. What we have here is since the baseline, on the x-axis, we have all of the weeks since really the start of the pandemic that was affecting the ridership in late February. On the y-axis, we have indexed ridership to the a late February baseline, and each line corresponds to a mode. So in yellow, we have bus. In the green, blue, orange, and red, we have the subway. You can also see in gray the silver line, and the dotted line is the ride trips. The ride is our paratransit operations. And as you can see here, that really starting in early March, late February, really March 10th, when the state of emergency was declared in the Commonwealth, ridership began to drop precipitously down to probably its lowest levels in mid-March, around the same time as the Commonwealth closed all non-essential businesses. However, again, to restate, you can see that three modes drop significantly less than other modes. Bus, our paratransit, and our blue line, versus the other subway lines and the Silver Line. And the bus dropped the least amount compared to its baseline. And again, I think this just reinforces where we've seen what we're considering, quote unquote, our durable ridership. Again, that ridership that is serving essential trips, communities that have less access to telework opportunities, communities that have less access to switch to other modes, such as walking and biking, due to geographic barriers. And then as you can see over the past few weeks, really through March, April, May, June, and into July, our ridership has slowly been returning. On bus, it's probably been about 5% week over week since early May. And as you can see, it's about 40% just around mid-July. However, so this is ridership holistically by mode. As said, though, when you dive into the ridership on a route by route basis, we see some very critical trends. And again, all these trends and information essentially inform the way we made decisions for how to deploy service starting this fall, August 30th. What you have here is an example of our top 20 routes by ridership pre-pandemic. On the x-axis, you have the top 20 routes by ridership. On the y-axis, you have the estimated riders per day. In the blue, you have the total estimated riders per day pre-COVID. So for example, the Route 1 had an average of 14,000 riders a weekday. And in the orange bar, you have the average estimated riders per day in mid-July. So in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And as you can see here, what you should really be looking at is the difference between the blue and the orange. We find that there are some routes, like the 28 and 111, which have nearly half of their ridership, or more than half of their ridership, already back to baseline versus March. And again, the 28, the 111, those are again routes that we believe have a much higher percentage of durable ridership. Again, they're more likely to be routes serving communities and customers who have to make essential trips, who may not have alternative options, who may have geographic barriers. The 111 is a great example of that, limited ways to get across the harbor. We then have routes like the 77, which serves over in the Cambridge area, which we believe is likely a mix between both those essential trips, such as going to the grocery store, and those communities where they are more likely to be doing 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. trips, or more likely to be serving communities that have greater access to telework options. We find those types of routes have some restored ridership, but not as much as, say, routes like the 28 and the 111. And then we have routes like the SL2, which are clearly very much entirely serving, or predominantly serving, those riders who are making those commuting trips really from the traditional commute routes. The SL2 only has take the inverse of that 86, about 15% of its baseline ridership, compared to something like the 28 and the 111. So to recap, we've seen changing ridership patterns where bus has been one of our most durable mode compared to all of our other modes. And then even within each route, we've seen a lot of variation route by route, which has required us from a service planning perspective to really think about deploying service on a route by route basis. We're also fundamentally trying to support physical distancing. Pre-pandemic, pre-COVID rather, we assumed on average, and when we did planning for how much service to put on each route, we assumed to try not to exceed an average of 46 to 52 passengers per 40-foot bus. During COVID-19, we are now planning for about 20 passengers per 40-foot bus. That's not to say that that is a hard limit. And that's not to say necessarily that sometimes there might be more than 20 passengers per bus. But from a planning perspective, 20 passengers per bus was essentially our threshold to say, if we're consistently seeing a bus route or a bus trip with more than 20 passengers per bus, it was a trigger to then say, okay, we actually want to see if we can put more bus resources on this route to try to bring down that level of crowding. So fundamentally, you can see here that our crowding threshold has been, our capacity in our buses is essentially half of what it was pre-pandemic, because we're trying to carry about half the passengers, or even less than half the passengers pre-pandemic. And then thirdly, one of the key elements to going into the sort of foundational principles for how we decided to think about service is recognizing that we're working with finite resources. In the short term, for several months, we have the same number of buses and operators. So taking this all together, what this all means is, since we know ridership is coming back, it's coming back on different modes, on different routes at different levels. We have half the capacity than we had pre-COVID. We wanted to be very strategic with where we're providing capacity. And fundamentally, what we have done is the MBTA has decided that it is obviously with input from municipalities, from communities, from riders, from our operators, that one of the most important things we can do is try to minimize crowding. So we are prioritizing running routes with less crowding versus on some routes, we're actually now reducing some service where we're seeing less ridership. So as we're about to go through in more detail, we're either trying to maintain capacity. So in some cases, we are trying to add more frequency than pre-COVID. So those routes that had more ridership and more crowding. So if you have half the capacity, in order to maintain capacity, we've had to add more buses to that route. And then on the flip side, on some routes and areas, we are reducing capacity where ridership is lower, because this means, even if this means less frequency, route structure changes, span changes, so when the route starts and when the route ends. And in some places, we are continuing to suspend some bus routes so that we can maintain capacity on those higher ridership routes. And this is fundamentally because the MBTA has a finite number of resources, so we must make those trade-offs to ensure the most optimal service plan for everyone. So I'm now going to hand it over to Melissa DeLay to both go through more details as well as elaborate on any areas that I may have inadvertently missed while walking through the overall framework for how we made these decisions.
Thanks, Kat. So here is a bit more detail on specific route changes that are going to take effect with our fall schedule period that starts August 30th. The first weekday of that would be August 31st. So many routes that were not operating on weekdays are going to resume service. We've been operating what we call emergency schedules, which is essentially a Saturday service level since approximately March 17th. And in many cases, that means that routes that did not have a Saturday schedule have not been operating at all. So you can see routes like the 4, 27, 52, and the others that are listed here that have no Saturday service. Those routes are going to resume with the fall schedules. Now, in some cases, we've also been operating with these emergency schedules, reduced Saturday service levels. So for those routes where we anticipate the need for continued capacity, we're going to resume same or better than pre-COVID frequency levels. So that means getting back to like a typical weekday, or even better than a typical weekday schedule for a number of routes. And in particular, routes like the 22, 23, 70, 86, in many cases, those routes are going to be more frequent than they were in March because of the crowding that we've seen and that we project to continue into the fall schedules. Now, on the other side, weekday service in some cases is going to improve from its Saturday service levels, but in some cases, those are not going to resume their full regular weekday schedule frequency that they saw in March and before. So in some cases, we think that because of the softened ridership levels that we've seen, maybe perhaps due to increased access to working from home, there's some routes where we are recommending modest service frequency reductions, but it's still going to be better than the Saturday service levels that we see today. So that is routes like the 7 and the 11, the 16, and the other routes that are listed here. Then on the next slide, I have just a little bit more of a detailed example to show for the route 111. This just gets a little bit more detail to kind of underscore what I was mentioning on the previous slide. So Route 111 is an example of one of our very durable ridership routes, where we saw both that ridership didn't drop off as steeply as it had dropped off on some other bus routes or rail routes. And we've also seen that ridership is rebounding to higher levels, not quite to pre-COVID levels certainly, but higher relative to the percentage that we've seen on other routes. So just as an illustration, for the spring schedules, this is what we were initially scheduled to operate, and we did operate on March 16th, but that was the only day of the spring schedule that we actually ran this. We were scheduled to operate 373 trips over the course of the entire weekday for the Route 111. Now on March 17th, when the emergency schedules kicked in, because that was a Saturday service level, the scheduled numbers of trips that we operated at that point were 300. So you can see there's a decrease there. During the next phase of the spring, during those emergency schedules, depending on our operator availability, so we did actually have a number of operators who were out sick during that period, or who were taking care of others who might have been sick. As we were able to, we added some trips when we could, but it was somewhere between those 300 regularly scheduled trips plus up to 60 or so additional kind of flexible service trips, because we did have some operators available, maybe not so many in the worst of it in, say, mid-April, but as we continued into May and June and our workforce was able to recover, we were able to add more of those trips, which corresponded to the kind of slow continuing growth in ridership as ridership recovered. Then for the June schedules, which took effect June 22nd, we actually scheduled in more trips than we had, because we'd seen that the Route 111 ridership had been quite durable, and also because when we, in our previous schedule, we had been assuming, 40 and 50 people would be acceptable loads, but all of a sudden our new definition of what crowding meant, we were aiming for design loads of, say, 20 people, which meant we needed more trips to offer the same capacity. So it's still lowered capacity, but it's an increase of up to now 447 scheduled trips per weekday, and that's the service that's operating today. And then for the new fall changes that we're here to talk about, we've actually inched that number up just a little bit higher. We're planning to operate 456 111 trips per weekday. So this is just an example of how the number of trips on a very large and very important route has shifted as we've made our schedule adjustments that we're here to talk to you about. So on the next slide, I can get into some of the other specific details. Now this is a little bit more surgical. So we have three particular kind of changes that are going on. So for one, the 62-76 combination, that's normally, that is the Saturday variant that operates on it's a combination of both the 62, which goes to Bedford, and the 76, which serves Lexington, Lincoln Lab, and some other areas. In this case, the service is going to remain suspended on the regular 62 and the regular 76, but we're restructuring the service so that we can continue to provide service in that corridor. So for the fall schedule, we're making a route change in that we are only going to serve the Hanscom Civil Air Terminal outbound in the morning, peak periods largely, and inbound in the afternoon peak periods. What that means is that anyone who's coming from Bedford into ALY Station or going back in the afternoon should have a more direct ride, because that's a sizable diversion for someone who is trying to make that through trip. So we're also increasing frequency so that we'll have service instead of every hour. During rush hours, it should operate every half hour. So those two changes on the 62 and 76 should maintain service to most people who are using the individual 62 or the individual 76. We also have a route structure change for the 84 and 78. The 84 normally operates from the Arlemont Village area and connects to Alewife Station. And the 78 also most of the day serves Arlemont Village, but during rush hours, it would actually originate at Arlington Heights and omit Arlemont Village. So one thing that we are recommending for the fall changes is to continue the suspension of the Route 84 temporarily and to flex those Arlington Heights trips to serve Arlemont Village. So it'll be a consistent service pattern for the entire day. So Arlemont Village will still be served, Arlington Heights will still be served, and even Park Ave, which is normally served by the rush hour 78s, will still be served by the 62/76 combination. So everyone would still be served, it's just that the service pattern is slightly different. And then the 170, which is not shown directly on this map, would remain suspended for the fall. And we have a number of other specific situations, but I'm gonna skip through a couple slides. Okay, here, perfect. We have a number of changes happening for our Newton Corner routes. So a number of our express buses. Again, these restructurings are ways that we can, in general, reduce the amount of resources that we've seen in express routes where the ridership has dropped off more substantially. A lot of these commuter-oriented routes are areas where we've seen the biggest decreases in ridership because perhaps more of these folks are able to work from home. There aren't as many people traveling into the downtown Boston area. So one of the ways that we are going to restructure service to maintain some connectivity, but perhaps a bit reduced, is to combine the route 502 and 504. So it's going to be numbered the 504, but it would serve anyone who was originally on the 502 would be able to board the 504 from Watertown Yard through Newton Corner, and it'll travel via the Turnpike Express to Copley, where it would then travel via the surface to get to Federal and Franklin downtown. So this is actually similar to what would operate middays and other times of day on the 504 variant trips, but it's instead going to be the all-day service pattern, except for maybe one or two very early morning trips. Similarly, the 501 and 503 are going to have that same combination. So coming from Brighton Center, traveling up Tremont Street to Newton Corner, anyone who would be destined for Back Bay or to downtown area would be able to board the 501. And again, the bus would travel express via Turnpike, taking people to both Copley and then via the surface over to Federal and Franklin. The 505 is slated to remain suspended for the fall schedule, but there are alternate options available in the area, either commuter rail or 57, or connecting to the 57 from the 553, 554, 556, or 558. And then lastly, those services 553, 554, 556, and 558 would be modified to only operate local service to Newton Corner. Service on the Turnpike would no longer be provided for those routes, and anyone continuing downtown would be able to transfer at Newton Corner to 504 or 501 as appropriate, or there's also, if it works better, folks can also make use of the commuter rail. Some midday service would no longer operate on specifically the 554, 556, and 558. And also for the 554, the variant that goes up to Trapello Road would no longer operate. We have a few other buckets of changes to talk through. Some routes are combined or extended to replace other routes. So for example, with the 136, 137, midday service from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. on weekdays operates only inbound as a 137 and outbound as a 136. So some passengers may need to ride through the end of the line if you're trying to go around the lake. And this is similar to what we do on Sundays. So that service pattern should be familiar to folks. Similarly, the 214 and 216 on middays from 10 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. It would be a combined 216 Hausneck via Germantown that is similar to what we do on weekends. So that should be familiar. So everyone would continue to be served. It's just that it would be on one of those two routes, but every portion of the route would still be served. Then for the next subset of routes, weekday service would operate only during morning and afternoon peak periods with reduced frequency. So these are some of our routes where we were really struggling with whether we could keep them operating, but it was important to maintain a skeletal amount of service. So it might be every 45 minutes to an hour in some cases, and it would only be during rush hours that those routes operate. And then for the other two buckets shown here, frequency may be reduced on a number of routes, both weekdays or weekends. You can see the routes listed here. On weekdays, it would be the 4, the 91, 92, and we can read the other listed routes here. SL1 and SL2 in particular are areas where we've seen big drop-offs in ridership, both because of reduced airport travel in the case of the SL1, or in the case of the SL2, it's a very commuter-oriented route, so we've seen decreased ridership there. And then there are a number of weekend routes where we've also seen drop-offs on ridership and where we've needed to flex those hours to other places that have had weekend crowding. For example, the last bucket shown here shows some of those areas where we did have weekend crowding, like on the 10, the 11, 44, 45, and others, where we're actually improving the frequency so that we can try to cut down on that crowding that we've seen.
In terms of next steps, thank you all for listening to this recording. We will be hosting live public meetings on August 12th and 13th, 2020. On August 12th, that will start at 6 p.m. and will be in Spanish. And on the 13th, it will also start at 6 p.m. and be in English. And MBTA staff will be available to answer any questions that anyone might have about these fall service changes. Also, throughout August and September, we will make available an online survey. Again, that's mbta.com/service changes, all one word, that will link to a survey where people can provide specific feedback or general feedback about these changes. Due to the timeline, the feedback we receive, there will be limited ability to adjust our fall schedules, but we do change our schedules roughly every 3 months, and we're going to use this feedback we received to help inform our winter and spring schedule changes, as we assume we will be operating in these conditions for several months yet until a vaccine is widely available. Obviously, of course, pending additional feedback and direction from the Commonwealth. And then finally, before we close, or I hand over to Melissa or Anthony to see if there are any final statements, I just want to remind our listeners here that we're specifically talking about the fall service bus changes going on, again, effective August 30th. That being said, there will be also plans for potentially commuter rail changes later this fall, and there's a whole other additional COVID-19 related series of efforts being conducted by the MBTA as related to cleaning and decontamination, and others which can all be found on mbta.com if you have more questions about how is the MBTA responding to COVID-19. And with that, Melissa or Anthony, anything else you guys would like to add?
No, that's all I have. So thanks everyone for listening. Anthony?
I'm all set, Kat. Thanks.
Great. Thank you both, and thank you all for listening. And for those who were able to join, we look forward to continuing the dialogue throughout August. Thank you all.